In 1978, temporarily unable to continue work on Noah's Ark, Ron Wyatt took his two sons, Danny and Ronnie, to a site in Egypt he believed might be where the Red Sea crossing took place. When they arrived at the site on the Gulf of Aqaba, they found a Phoenician-style column lying on the beach. The water had eroded away the inscription, but in 1984, Ron found a matching column on the opposite shore in Saudi Arabia, still standing, with the inscription still intact. He was later able to translate the words Pharaoh, Mizraim, Death, Edom, Yahweh, and Solomon from this second column, and from this he believes these columns were erected by King Solomon and dedicated to Yahweh for the great miracle of the crossing of the sea on dry land. Israel was occupying the Sinai Peninsula at this time in 1978 and moved this first column from the beach and set it in concrete across the road, as you can see here. Diving at this site, they filmed numerous coral-encrusted chariot parts, such as these two chariot wheels still attached to an axle, one wheel flat on the ground and the other in the air. This is a six-spoked wheel. They found a vast amount of artifacts which loudly attest to the miracle which occurred here. Horse and human skeletal remains are still preserved by the coral, as are chariot cabs without wheels, wheels without cabs, some wheels on axles, and some not. He retrieved a chariot wheel hub, which he presented to Nassif Mohammed Hassan, who was the director of antiquities in Cairo, Egypt. But the most astounding find was this gold-veneered four-spoke chariot wheel, which he was able to video in March of 1988, but he was unable to retrieve it as the wood had disintegrated, leaving only a thin gold shell. There were many factors which led Ron to this site, but three were most compelling. First, in order for the Israelites to have left Egypt proper, they would have had to have begun their journey to the Red Sea on the eastern side of the Gulf of Suez. This left only the Gulf of Aqaba. Second, there is only one place along the shoreline of the Gulf of Aqaba which could hold the perhaps 3 million people. This area is so large it can be seen from this satellite photo. And finally, when Ron studied the bathymetric maps of the British Admiralty in London, he saw a perfect underwater pathway led across the Gulf at this point. On either side of this line across the Gulf of Aqaba, the waters were 5,000 feet deep, dropping off like a deep gorge. But here, at this precise spot, was an area leading across which gently sloped at a 6-degree angle to a depth of only 900 to 1,000 feet in the center. As Ron and the boys journeyed across the Sinai to this site, they noticed large boulders pushed over to the sides of the wadis or canyons, allowing caravans and travelers to pass through. But as they dove into the Gulf, about 1.5 miles out and 200 feet deep, they were thrilled to see this same stone-cleared pathway continued and was still evident in the crystal-clear waters. With the overwhelming evidence of the chariot parts scattered across the Gulf, Ron knew that Mount Sinai was in Saudi Arabia. Studying maps, he saw that Jabal el-Lawz fit the biblical description of this holy mountain. Unable to get a visa to enter Saudi Arabia, Ron and his two sons finally decided to enter without one. He had learned that the normal procedure if someone were caught without a visa there was to escort the visitor to the border and see that they did not re-enter. They found Mount Sinai with the altar and much more still intact in this uninhabited area. But as they were leaving, they were abruptly arrested and imprisoned for 78 days, accused of being Israeli spies. When they were finally released, they were told that a man had contacted the Saudi embassy and reported the Wyatts to be Israeli spies pretending to be archaeologists. This man had been a trusted friend who had worked with Ron on Noah's Ark.
Ronald Wyatt and his sons are with us in the studios of our Nashville affiliate WTVF to tell us all about it. Gentlemen, good morning.
Morning.
Mr. Wyatt, you there in the middle, and
Yes.
your sons on either side. Why did you, I didn't know that Mount Sinai was in Saudi Arabian territory. Why did you think it was?
We found some chariot parts that looked like the chariots found in King Tut's tomb in the Gulf of Aqaba, west of this Jebel El Lawz. We found these at depths from 60 feet out to 200 feet and over a stretch of about a mile and a half. And we believe that that was the crossing site. And so in the biblical narrative, they arrived at Mount Sinai after crossing the Red Sea. The language in the Bible indicates that they stayed in a mountain, enclosed in a mountain. So an aerial map showed that this Jebel El Lawz had a large valley enclosed in the rim of an ancient volcano. There's about 5,000 acres in there. We felt this was the place. And in Exodus 24:4 and in Leviticus 6:28, 11:33, and 15:12, it tells of some artifacts that were to be found. There was to be 12 pillars of stone and an altar and some pottery. And so this is why we looked at that particular mountain.
From the beach in Egypt on the Gulf of Aqaba, we have gazed across the water with anguish for many years, knowing that Moses led the great multitude across the Red Sea at this exact spot. Ron Wyatt knew in 1978 that Mount Sinai lay beyond that distant shore. Mount Sinai, where the law was written by God's own finger. Finally, we can see this majestic mountain where God's own presence once rested. Jebel El Lawz in northwest Saudi Arabia. In Galatians 4:25, the Apostle Paul tells us, "For this Agar is Mount Sinai in Arabia." Exodus 19:18, "And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire." Could this blackened peak be the result of the consuming fire of God's own presence resting upon it? In 1 Kings 19, verses 8 and 9, we read how Elijah came to Horeb and went into a cave. Here we see a very large cave just below the solitary tree which is between two massive granite boulders. As we view the holy precinct, the area at the foot of the mountain, we can see a large fence and a guardhouse, which was erected immediately after Ron Wyatt showed this site to a Saudi archaeologist in 1985. This fence follows along the line of 18-foot diameter boundary markers which Moses was directed to erect by God. This sign by the guardhouse states that this is an archaeological site passed by royal decree, and that it is unlawful to trespass, subject to penalty. And as we pan to the left, here we can see where the fence ends on the other side. And now, as we pan away from the holy precinct, we look out into the area of the camp of the Israelites. There are several archaeological remains still here, but this one is of particular interest for us. In Exodus chapter 32, we read of the golden calf and how Aaron fashions it. And in verse 5, "And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made proclamation and said, 'Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord.'" There is little doubt that these are the remains of that very altar which Aaron built to the golden calf. When the Saudi archaeologist from Riyadh University, who went there with Ron in 1985, saw this, he was very excited. The 12 petroglyphs of cows and bulls captured his interest because they are found nowhere else in Saudi Arabia. The style of their horns and bodies is distinctly ancient Egyptian, the same style found in the temples and tombs of ancient Egypt. Unable to enter the holy precinct from the front and climb upon Mount Sinai, we now approach it from the backside, where the two large boulders with the solitary tree between them can be seen. Climbing the mountain here, we soon find ourselves on top of a large, sheltered plateau. Here we have a better view of the blackened peak. Panning the area, we find it to easily be large enough to accommodate the 70 elders who accompanied Moses up into the mountain at one point in time. The peak to the left is where the solitary tree is, but it cannot be seen because of our angle. And just ahead, over that ledge, lies the holy precinct. Looking down, we see the fence which follows along the bounds set by Moses, and just beyond that fence is part of the camp of the Israelites. Zooming in closer to the holy precinct, we can see the remains of an ancient foundation. Could this be the remains of the first tabernacle which Moses removed to the outside of the camp after the golden calf incident? Exodus 33 verse 7, "And Moses took the tabernacle and pitched it without the camp, afar off from the camp, and called it the tabernacle of the congregation." And directly adjacent to this foundation are the remains of an altar built of stone. Exodus 20:25, "And thou wilt make me an altar of stone, thou shalt not build it of hewn stone." Panning further, we stop to look at the tracks made by the Bedouins' trucks before the fence was erected. This gives you a better idea of the size perspective of the enormity of this area. And here we see the guard building and archaeological sign which we saw earlier from the front. Returning back to the foundation we saw earlier, the camera begins to pan outward where we will be able to see the location of the altar to the golden calf. Exodus 32:19. And it came to pass, as soon as he came nigh unto the camp, that he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger waxed hot, and he cast the tables out of his hands and brake them beneath the mount. Still visible today also is the stream bed which descended from the mountain to give the people abundant water for themselves and their flocks and herds. Preparing to leave, we can look down upon the backside of the mountain, and again we see the vast plain area. Arriving on the opposite side of this mountain, we find an area which fits the biblical description of Rephidim, the last encampment of the Israelites before they reach Mount Sinai. Exodus 17:6. The Lord tells Moses, Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. The most incredible evidence for this sight is the giant split boulder upon a hill with evidence that large streams of water flowed from it. The rocks still display the erosion pattern of tremendous amounts of water descending from this rock. And as we travel through the split in the boulder, we soon can see the channels cut in the rock from the water flow on the other side. And panning outward, we can see these channels continue out into the plain. After the battle, when Israel had defeated the Amalekites, the Bible tells us that Moses did something. As we go to Exodus 17, verse 15, and Moses built an altar and called the name of it Jehovah Nissi. Here are the remains of a very ancient altar, part of it fallen, perhaps from an earthquake or Bedouins looking for treasure inside. But enough is still intact to show it was indeed an altar, as it is not hollow inside, but solid all the way through. We continue toward the Red Sea. And just up ahead, we can barely see the Gulf of Aqaba. As we continue our approach, the wadi or canyon seems so narrow from afar, but now it can be seen to be large enough for the vast multitude to have traveled through. And across the sea, we can see the large beach area on the Egyptian side. Just as the beach on the Egyptian side is certainly large enough to accommodate several million people, here we can see that this beach also contains a tremendous plain. In Exodus 14, verse 30, we read, Thus the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the sea shore. In 1984, When Ron and his sons were imprisoned here in Saudi, Ron directed his captors to this beach in a helicopter where he showed them a Phoenician-style column on this beach with inscriptions in archaic Hebrew that said that King Solomon had erected this column in honor of Yahweh to commemorate the crossing of the Red Sea on dry land. Today, all that remains there is this marker noting the location of that column, and while we do not know where they have taken it, we feel sure it is protected and will be located soon. As we look out into the sea, we can see the end of the tongue of the underwater land bridge, and that it leads across to this very beach just beyond where the column once rested. Panning the beach, we also can see the restored remains of the ancient fortress we believe was Baal Zephon of the biblical account.